All right, so let's dive into something that I think affects all of us pretty deeply, right? I mean, the economy. But
Yeah.
more specifically, how do we even like measure how healthy it is? Again, it can't be as simple as taking its temperature or something, right?
You're absolutely right. It's definitely more complicated than that. It's kind of like, when you go to the doctor and they check your blood pressure, heart rate, they got to run a whole bunch of tests to really get the full picture.
Ah, okay, I see.
Yeah, so similarly in economics, we use a whole set of indicators to understand what's going on. We look at things like economic growth, inflation, unemployment, and how a country's trading with the rest of the world to get a good sense of how the economy is doing overall.
So it sounds like it's less about finding like one magic number and more about understanding all these smaller signals, right?
Precisely. It's all about putting the pieces together to make sense of the bigger picture.
Speaking of signals, remember like the UK's inflation crisis last year, like
Mm.
that 11% inflation rate, that wasn't just like some number on a screen, right? People were really feeling it in their wallets.
Oh, absolutely. That's a perfect example of how these indicators have a real impact on people's lives.
Like,
Businesses were struggling to keep up with those skyrocketing costs.
for sure.
Yeah, and the government had to make some tough choices about how to respond to it all.
That's why I'm really excited to dive into this article today called How to Measure Economic Performance.
Great article.
Yeah. We're gonna unpack each of these indicators, and trust me, there's some really fascinating insights here. You might even end up like completely rethinking some of your assumptions about how the economy works.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the most interesting things the article highlights is how all these indicators are interconnected. Like, for instance, trying to boost economic growth too quickly can sometimes lead to higher inflation.
Ah, okay, yeah.
It's a real balancing act for policymakers.
So it's not just like good news, bad news. It's all kind of tangled up.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's start with that first one we mentioned, economic growth. We always hear this term thrown around, but what does it actually mean? I mean, beyond just like good times.
Well, at its core, economic growth refers to an increase in a country's real gross domestic product. You've probably heard of that GDP.
GDP, yep, yep.
It basically measures the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific period of time.
So it's basically like how much stuff a country is making and selling.
Exactly. And when that number goes up, it generally signals that the economy is expanding, people are earning more, and businesses are investing and hiring.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good on the surface, but I have a feeling there's more to it, right?
Hmm.
The article mentioned something about different types of growth, didn't it?
You're right. It's important to distinguish between actual growth and potential growth. Think of actual growth like a short-term boost to the economy. It could be, something like a surge in spending during the holidays.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Gives the economy this temporary lift. But potential growth, on the other hand, is more about expanding an economy's capacity to produce more in the long run.
Oh, okay.
So instead of a quick sugar rush, it's more about building muscle for long-term strength.
So it's less about like a quick sugar rush and more about building muscle for the long term. Yeah.
Exactly. It's driven by things like, investing in better infrastructure, improving education so you have a skilled workforce, and fostering technological innovation.
So those things that actually increase how much a country can produce overall, not just like selling a bunch of stuff in 1 month.
Yeah, and China's economic boom over the past few decades is a great example of this. Their rapid GDP growth really did lift millions of people out of
It's
poverty.
incredible, yeah. But I know there's got to be a but,
Right.
right?
This impressive growth came at a pretty steep environmental cost. They've been dealing with serious problems like pollution and depletion of natural resources.
Yeah. So it's like focusing just on that GDP number without thinking about the wider impact can actually backfire, right? I mean, it's not the full picture.
That's right. It raises the question, how can governments balance the need for economic growth with the need to protect the environment and ensure sustainability for the future?
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Mm.
And I think the answer probably isn't the same for every country, right?
Yeah, definitely not. It's a very complex challenge, and the right approach will depend on each country's unique circumstances and priorities.
Okay, well, let's move on to another big one that I think everyone's pretty familiar with. Inflation. I mean, we all basically know it means prices are going up, but can you break it down for us? Like, what's actually going on there?
Simply put, inflation is the rate at which the prices of goods and services increase over time.
Mhm.
As prices rise, your money doesn't buy as much as it used to, so your purchasing power decreases.
Yeah, we all felt that last year, right?
Yeah.
It felt like the price of everything just suddenly went up.
Absolutely. It can really hit people's wallets hard.
So like groceries, gas, rent, everything costing more means your money just doesn't stretch as far.
Exactly. And that's why inflation is such a concern for individuals, businesses, and governments.
Okay, so the article also mentioned different types of inflation. Can you explain those a bit more?
Sure. There's what's called demand pull inflation, which happens when there's too much money circulating in the economy and everyone wants to buy the same limited goods and services. Think about a hot new toy during the holiday season. Everyone wants it, demand skyrockets, and as a result, the price shoots up.
Ah, yeah, classic supply and demand, right?
Right. And then you have what's called cost push inflation. That's when the actual cost of producing goods and services goes up.
Okay, so like what kinds of things would cause that?
Well, it could be rising energy prices like we've seen recently, or disruptions to supply chains, maybe because of a natural disaster or political instability.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes even labor shortages can drive up costs because businesses have to pay higher wages to attract workers.
Makes sense. So basically, any of those increases in costs, they just get passed along to us,
Right.
consumers, in the form of higher prices, right?
Unfortunately, yeah. Businesses have to protect their profits, and
Yeah.
those higher costs often get reflected in the prices they charge.
Okay, so let's tie this back to the UK's 11% inflation rate last year. Like, what was the main driver there? Was it more like that demand pull or that cost push?
Well, honestly, it was a bit of a perfect storm of both factors. You had pent-up demand after the pandemic, so people were eager to spend.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you had those global energy price shocks, partly because of the conflict in Ukraine, and then you add in those supply chain disruptions that made it way more expensive to get things into the UK.
So like a real double whammy.
Exactly, a combination of factors all pushing prices upwards.
But okay, this is something I've always been a little confused about. Why is some inflation actually seen as a good thing for the economy?
That's a great question. And it might seem counterintuitive, but a small amount of inflation, around 2%, is generally considered healthy for a couple of reasons.
Okay.
First, it encourages people to spend money rather than hoard it. If prices are gradually rising, you're more likely to buy something today rather than wait a year when it might cost more.
Ah, okay, so it kind of keeps the economy moving.
Exactly. That spending helps businesses grow and create jobs. Second, moderate inflation gives businesses a little wiggle room to adjust prices and wages without having to resort to drastic measures like layoffs.
So it's like finding that sweet spot. Like too much is obviously a bad thing, but a little nudge can actually be beneficial.
Precisely. The key is to keep inflation within a manageable range. If it starts spiraling out of control, it creates uncertainty, erodes people's savings, and can even lead to social and political instability.
Yeah, so it's like finding that Goldilocks zone, right? Like not too hot, not too cold.
Exactly. And finding that balance is one of the biggest challenges for central banks and policymakers.
Okay, well, let's tackle another big one that is definitely on a lot of people's minds. I mean, unemployment. This is a topic that really hits close to home for a lot of people, and I think it's a really good indicator of how an economy is actually doing for everyday folks.
Absolutely. Unemployment refers to people who are actively seeking work but are unable to find a job. And it's one of the most closely watched economic indicators because it directly impacts people's livelihoods and overall well-being.
Yeah, for sure. And we often hear about the unemployment rate, which tells us like the percentage of the workforce that's unemployed, right?
That's right. It gives us a snapshot of how many people are out of work at a particular point in time. But as with many economic indicators, it's important to dig a little deeper and understand the nuances behind that number.
Okay, so what are some of those nuances? The article mentioned something about different types of unemployment, right?
Yeah, it's not just one monolithic thing. There are actually several different types of unemployment, each with its own causes and potential solutions.
Okay, well, let's break those down then.
All right, so first you have what's called cyclical unemployment. This is the type of unemployment that rises during economic downturns or recessions. When businesses are struggling, they often have to lay off workers, which leads to an increase in the unemployment rate.
So that's like when the overall economy is doing poorly and it kind of has a ripple effect on the job market, right?
Exactly. And then there's what's called structural unemployment. This is a bit more long-term and is often caused by shifts in the structure of an economy. For example, as technology advances or certain industries decline, workers with specific skills might find themselves out of work because their jobs are no longer in demand.
Oh, okay. So like, for instance, coal miners losing their jobs as the world shifts to renewable energy.
Exactly. That's a classic example of structural unemployment. The skills of those coal miners are no longer as valuable in the new energy landscape, and they may need to retrain for different jobs.
Yeah, retraining definitely seems key in that situation.
Absolutely. Then there's what we call frictional unemployment. This is the type of unemployment that exists even in a healthy economy, and it's generally short term in nature. It occurs when people are between jobs, maybe they've just graduated, they've quit to look for a better opportunity, or they've moved to a new city.
Okay, so it's like the natural churn of the job market.
Exactly. It takes time for people to find new jobs, and a certain level of frictional unemployment is to be expected. And finally, you have what's called seasonal unemployment. This affects jobs tied to specific seasons, such as tourism, agriculture, or retail during the holidays.
Yeah, that one's pretty self-explanatory. So like if you're a ski instructor, you're probably not working in the summer.
Exactly. So you see, understanding these different types of unemployment is really crucial for policymakers because it helps them tailor solutions to the specific problems at hand.
Yeah, it seems like a blanket solution wouldn't really work in that situation. You'd need different approaches for each type.
Exactly. One policy might be effective in addressing cyclical unemployment, but wouldn't do much to help those facing structural unemployment.
Right. So understanding the nuances is key.
Yeah.
And I think it can also be helpful for individuals, right? Like if you're worried about job security, maybe you should focus on industries that are less affected by economic downturns or those that are likely to grow in the future.
That's a great point. Being aware of the different types of unemployment can definitely help people navigate the job market more strategically.
Okay, the article also mentioned this thing called the Phillips curve. What's that all about? I have to admit I've heard the term before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
Well, the Phillips curve is a really important concept in macroeconomics. It basically describes the relationship between inflation and unemployment.
Okay, I'm listening.
It suggests that there's an inverse relationship between the two. In other words, as unemployment falls, inflation tends to rise, and vice versa.
So wait, lower unemployment actually leads to higher inflation. How does that work?
It all comes down to the forces of supply and demand in the labor market. When unemployment is low, businesses have to compete more fiercely for workers, which often leads to higher wages. And those higher wages can then lead to companies increasing prices to maintain their profit margins.
Ah, okay. So it's like this chain reaction. Lower unemployment leads to higher wages, which then pushes up inflation.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how seemingly unrelated economic factors can be interconnected and influence each other.
So in a way, it's a bit of a trade-off. Lower unemployment might come at the cost of higher inflation.
In a sense, yes. It highlights the delicate balance that policymakers have to strike. They want to keep unemployment low to boost economic growth and improve people's livelihoods, but they also need to keep inflation in check to prevent it from eroding purchasing power and destabilizing the economy.
It's definitely a complex balancing act. And speaking of real-world complexity, the article mentioned the UK's current situation where they have both low unemployment and skills shortages. Like, how does that fit into all of this?
It's a fascinating case study. The UK has one of the lowest unemployment rates in decades, which on the surface sounds like a great thing. However, they're simultaneously facing skills shortages in several key sectors. This means that even though people are looking for work, they might not have the specific skills that employers are desperately searching for.
Oh, wow. So it's like having a lot of people who are ready and willing to work, but they don't necessarily have the right training or experience for the jobs that are available.
Precisely. And this situation can lead to some interesting economic dynamics. For example, businesses might have to offer higher wages to attract qualified workers, which can contribute to inflationary pressures.
Yeah, I see. So it's another example of those complex interconnections we were talking about earlier. It makes me wonder, can an economy actually have too much employment?
That might sound counterintuitive, but yes, it is possible. When unemployment gets extremely low, it can lead to what economists call overheating. This means the economy is operating at near full capacity, and businesses are struggling to find the workers they need. It can lead to bottlenecks in production, higher prices, and even runaway inflation.
So it's like pushing a car engine too hard. It might work for a while, but eventually something's going to break down.
That's a great analogy. And it illustrates why economists and policymakers pay close attention to these indicators and try to steer the economy toward a sustainable path, avoiding those extremes of either too much or too little employment.
Okay, well, let's move on to our final economic indicator for today. This one, I have to admit, has always been a bit of a mystery to me, the balance of payments. Can you demystify that one for us?
Absolutely. It might sound intimidating, but it's actually not that complicated. Think of it like a giant financial statement that tracks all the economic transactions between a country and the rest of the world.
Okay, so it's basically showing whether a country is earning more than it's spending on an international level.
Exactly. It includes everything from exports and imports of goods and services to investments, foreign aid, and even money transfers by individuals. And it's broken down into different components, each providing valuable insights into a country's economic relationships with other countries.
Okay, so what are some of those components? I often hear about trade deficits and surpluses, but I'm not always sure I fully understand what those mean.
Well, a trade deficit occurs when a country imports more goods and services than it exports. It's essentially spending more on foreign products than it's earning from selling its own goods abroad.
Got it.
And a trade surplus is the opposite. It means a country is exporting more than it's importing, so it's bringing in more money from international trade than it's spending.
Okay, so is one inherently better than the other? Like, is a trade surplus always good and a trade deficit always bad?
It's actually not that simple. Both can have their advantages and disadvantages depending on the context.
Ah, okay, so there are nuances to consider there as well.
Exactly. For example, a trade surplus can boost a country's GDP and create jobs, but it can also lead to tensions with trading partners who might accuse the surplus country of unfair trade practices.
Okay, so let's look at some real-world examples. Germany's often praised for their trade surplus, right?
Yes, Germany has consistently run large trade surpluses for decades, thanks to their strong manufacturing sector and global demand for products like cars, machinery, and chemicals. This has definitely contributed to their economic strength.
Yeah.
But it has also led to some criticism, particularly from countries like the US, who argue that Germany's surplus is partly due to an undervalued currency that makes their exports artificially cheap.
Interesting. So there are always different perspectives on these issues.
Absolutely. And then you have the US, which has had a persistent trade deficit for many years. This is largely due to their high consumer demand and reliance on imports from countries like China.
Yeah. Made in China is everywhere, right?
It is. Now, this trade deficit has led to some concerns about the decline of U.S. manufacturing and job losses, but it also reflects the fact that U.S. consumers have access to a wide variety of goods at relatively affordable prices.
So it's a double-edged sword, I guess.
Exactly. It's important to consider both the pros and cons and to understand the underlying factors driving these trade imbalances. It's never just black and white.
Okay, so how do these trade imbalances actually affect currencies?
That's a great question. Currency exchange rates are influenced by a whole bunch of factors, but trade flows definitely play a role.
Okay.
When a country has a trade deficit, it means there's a higher demand for foreign currency to pay for those imports, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And this increased demand can lead to a depreciation of the domestic currency, making imports more expensive and exports more competitive.
Ah, so a weaker currency can actually help to correct a trade deficit.
To some extent, yes. It can make a country's exports more attractive to foreign buyers and discourage imports, which can eventually help to bring those trade flows back into balance.
It's fascinating how it all works. It's like this constant push and pull between different economic forces.
It is, and it highlights the importance of understanding these indicators not just in isolation, but also how they interact with each other and influence the overall global economic landscape.
This has been incredible so far. We've covered so much ground, and I'm already starting to see the economy through a whole new lens. It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about real-world effects and even geopolitical influence.
Exactly. Understanding these indicators gives us a deeper insight into the forces shaping our world, and that can help us make more informed decisions about everything from our personal finances to government policies.
It's amazing how it all ties together.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how all of these, like, economic indicators, they're not just like some theoretical things. They actually play out in the real world.
Absolutely.
And sometimes with consequences that we maybe didn't even anticipate, right?
It's true.
Like when we were talking about China's economic growth earlier, I mean, they did lift millions of people out of poverty,
Right.
which is amazing. But like we said, there have been these pretty significant costs to the environment.
It really highlights that challenge, doesn't it? That progress often comes at a price.
Yeah.
And in China's case, a lot of that growth was fueled by industries that are, well, pretty heavy polluters, you know? Lots of heavy industry and manufacturing, which hasn't exactly been good for the environment.
So it really raises a question, right? Like, how do we balance the need for economic growth with, protecting the planet?
It's a huge question. And honestly, there are no easy answers.
It makes you wonder if our current ways of measuring economic success are even, like, adequate anymore.
That's a really interesting point.
Right. Like, Should we be focusing solely on GDP, or should we also be considering things like environmental sustainability and people's overall well-being?
I think those are really crucial considerations. And there's actually a growing movement among economists who are pushing for a shift away from just focusing on material wealth.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, they're advocating for new measures that take into account things like environmental impact, social justice, and even happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah, because what's the point of a booming economy if, like, everyone's miserable and the planet is suffering?
Exactly. It's about creating a more holistic and sustainable vision of progress.
But how do you even measure something like happiness? That seems really subjective, doesn't it?
It's definitely tricky, but there are some interesting approaches being explored.
Oh, okay, like what?
Well, some researchers use surveys to gauge people's satisfaction with their lives. Others look at things like access to healthcare, education, levels of social trust, and even indicators of environmental quality.
Ah, okay. So it's like trying to capture a broader sense of well-being.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true prosperity involves a lot more than just how much money a country produces.
It really makes you wonder if some countries might be doing better than we think. I mean, if we just look at their GDP numbers, we might be missing a big part of the story, right?
I think that's very possible. Bhutan, for example, has famously adopted gross national happiness as a guiding principle for their development policies. And they've actually made significant progress in creating a more balanced and sustainable society.
That's really cool. Maybe it's time for other countries to like rethink their priorities and consider a wider range of indicators. But okay, let's come back to those more traditional measures for a minute. We talked about inflation before, but I'm curious about the actual impacts of it, both high and low.
Well, high inflation, like what the UK experienced last year, can have some pretty severe consequences.
Yeah.
It can really erode purchasing power, making it much harder for people to afford basic necessities.
Yeah, I remember reading about businesses in the UK having to change their prices like
Mm.
almost daily because their costs were fluctuating so much.
Absolutely. That kind of volatility is incredibly disruptive for businesses.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And for people on fixed incomes, like retirees, high inflation can be really devastating because their savings just don't go as far anymore.
It's a good reminder that inflation isn't just some like abstract economic concept,
Right.
right? It has a real impact on people's lives.
Exactly. It affects everyone in different ways.
What about low inflation then? Is that always a good thing?
Not necessarily. A small amount of inflation is generally seen as a positive sign because it encourages spending and keeps the economy humming.
Right.
But if inflation is too low or even negative, it can actually be a sign of a weak economy with very little growth.
So it's like finding that balance again.
Exactly. Too high and it can lead to instability.
Yeah.
Too low and it can signal stagnation.
So it's back to the Goldilocks principle.
Very much.
Inflation needs to be just right to keep things running smoothly.
And finding that sweet spot is a constant challenge for central banks.
For sure. They have to walk a tightrope between encouraging growth and keeping prices stable.
Exactly. They have a really delicate balancing act to perform.
Okay, so let's shift gears back to unemployment. We talked about the different types
Yeah,
earlier,
right.
but can you give us like some real-world examples of how those actually play out?
Sure. A classic example of structural unemployment is the Rust Belt region in the United States.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
It used to be a major manufacturing hub, particularly for steel and automobiles.
Yeah.
But over the past few decades, those industries have declined due to globalization, automation, and other factors.
Right. So those jobs just kind of disappeared.
And many workers lost their jobs, leading to widespread unemployment and economic hardship in the region.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example of how structural changes in the economy can have these really long-lasting impacts on communities.
It's a prime example.
So what strategies can be used to like help workers adapt to those kinds of changes? Like how do you help people develop new skills when their old jobs just aren't coming back?
Well, it's a really complex problem, and there's no easy solution. But some things that can help include retraining programs, investing in education, and supporting entrepreneurship.
Yeah, those all sound like good steps to take.
But it really requires a multi-pronged approach involving government, businesses, and educational institutions working together to create opportunities for displaced workers.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned automation earlier, and it makes me wonder, how is that trend going to affect unemployment in the future? I mean, are robots going to take all of our jobs?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's something that economists are debating pretty intensely.
Yeah.
Some experts predict that automation is going to lead to significant job losses, particularly in fields like manufacturing, transportation, and even some white-collar jobs.
It was a bit of a scary thought.
I know, it sounds a bit like a dystopian sci-fi movie. But there are also those who argue that automation will actually create new jobs, just like it has in the past.
Okay, so maybe it's not all doom and gloom.
Right. They point out that while some jobs may be lost, new ones will emerge in fields related to technology, data analysis, AI development, and so on.
So maybe it's more about a shift in the types of jobs that are available. Like, we'll need different skills for the jobs of the future.
That's the hope. But it will require significant investment in education and training to ensure that workers have the skills they need to thrive in this new economy.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the nature of work is constantly evolving. It makes you wonder if our traditional ways of measuring unemployment are even going to be relevant in the future, right?
That's another really important question to consider. The rise of the gig economy, with all these freelancers and independent contractors, has already posed a challenge to traditional labor statistics.
Yeah, because if you're working in the gig economy, you might not be officially classified as unemployed,
Exactly.
but you might still be struggling to make ends meet or find consistent work.
Right. So we might need to rethink how we define and measure unemployment to accurately reflect the realities of the modern workforce.
Yeah, for sure. The world of work is definitely changing, and our methods of tracking it need to keep up. Okay, so let's wrap up with the balance of payments. We talked about trade deficits and surpluses before,
Right.
but can you give us some more concrete examples of how those imbalances can actually play out in the real world?
Sure. One of the most prominent examples is the trade relationship between the U.S. and China. The U.S. has had a significant trade deficit with China for many
Well,
years.
I've heard a lot about that, yeah.
They import far more from China than they export to them. And this imbalance has been a major source of tension between the two countries, with accusations of unfair trade practices and currency manipulation.
Yeah, it seems like that's always in the headlines. What are the economic implications of this imbalance?
Well, for the U.S., the trade deficit has contributed to the loss of manufacturing jobs. Many companies have shifted production overseas to take advantage of lower labor costs in China.
Ah, so those jobs ended up going somewhere else.
Exactly. And it has also led to an increase in U.S. debt as they've had to borrow heavily from foreign countries, including China, to finance their consumption.
So it's not just about economics, right?
Right.
It also touches on national security and even geopolitical influence.
Absolutely. It's a very complex issue with far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So what about China then? How has the trade surplus affected them?
Well, for China, the trade surplus has undoubtedly been a major driver of their economic growth over the past few decades.
Right.
It has allowed them to accumulate vast foreign currency reserves and invest heavily in their infrastructure and industries.
But it's also caused some friction, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It has led to accusations that China is artificially suppressing the value of their currency to make their exports more competitive, which some argue is unfair to other countries.
No, again, it's this complicated mix of pros and cons.
Exactly. And it highlights how interconnected the global economy is. What happens in one country can have ripple effects across the world.
This has been such an eye-opening discussion. We've gone deep into these economic indicators, look at real-world examples, and seen how everything's so interconnected. It's made me realize that these things aren't just about numbers. They're about real people's lives and the future of our planet.
I completely agree. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world and using that knowledge to make more informed and responsible decisions.
Wow. So we've been on quite a journey. This deep dive into how we measure economic performance has really opened my eyes to how complex it all is.
Yeah, it's definitely not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance, is it?
Not at all. So as we wrap up here, what are some of the biggest takeaways from all this?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that economies are these incredibly intricate systems where, everything's connected.
Yeah.
Changes in one area can have these ripple effects throughout the whole system.
Yeah. And then, like we were saying before about that whole push and pull between inflation and unemployment, right?
Right.
Like if you try to lower unemployment too much, it can actually lead to higher inflation.
Exactly. It's a constant balancing act for policymakers.
It seems like they're always trying to juggle a million things at once. So
Yeah.
is there a right way to manage an economy?
Well, that's another key takeaway. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works in one country or even at one particular time might not be the right approach for another.
So it's not just about copying what someone else is doing.
Right. You have to take into account all sorts of factors. The country's specific circumstances, its history, its political system, its social values.
Uh, so much to consider.
It's about finding the right policies for that particular situation. And remember how we were talking about the different types of unemployment? Well, you need different strategies to address each of those.
Yeah, like a solution for cyclical unemployment wouldn't necessarily help with structural unemployment.
Precisely.
Okay, so it's all about, like, context, right?
Exactly. You can't just look at one indicator in isolation.
Yeah.
You have to consider it within the bigger picture of everything else that's going on in the world, all the global trends, political events, social changes.
Like how a trade deficit might be a bad thing in some situations, but in others, it could just mean that the economy is strong and people have money to spend.
Exactly. It's like piecing together a puzzle. You need all the pieces to see the full picture.
This deep dive has honestly been so eye-opening. We've explored all these key economic indicators, looked at real-world examples, and seen how everything's interconnected.
Yeah, it's been great.
But before we wrap up, I have one last question kind of looking ahead. I mean, we've talked about how the way we measure the economy has changed over time. So what are some of the new indicators that might become more important in the future?
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that economists are actively researching and debating right now. But I think as we become more aware of things like climate change and social inequality, we're going to see a bigger emphasis on indicators that measure sustainability, well-being, and social justice.
So it's like moving beyond just material wealth and considering a broader definition of prosperity, right?
Exactly. And with all the rapid advancements in technology, we'll probably need to develop entirely new indicators to measure the impact of things like automation and artificial intelligence on the economy and on society as a whole.
It's exciting to think about, but it also feels a little bit daunting. Like the way we measure economic performance is constantly evolving, which means our understanding of the economy is always changing too.
It definitely is. And that's why it's so important to stay curious, to keep learning, and to always be questioning our assumptions.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So that wraps up another episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of economic indicators. We hope you learned something new, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the forces shaping our world.